Caleb. She said it in her sleep, and he heard it from the hallway, where he had stopped walking, stopped breathing, stopped pretending he didn't care. 7 years of silence between them. 7 years of separate rooms, separate meals. A marriage that functioned like a business arrangement between two strangers. And then his name in the dark in her voice, not sharp, not angry. Broken. Longing. The sound of a woman who had spent 7 years waiting for a husband who was standing 3 feet away and had never once reached back. He stood in that hallway for a long time. He did not knock. He should have knocked. If you've ever loved someone who stopped seeing you, or been the one who stopped looking, stay until the very last word of this story. Subscribe to our channel, follow every chapter, and tell us in the comments what city you're watching from tonight. We want to know how far this story travels. The morning began, the way every morning began on the Thornton Ranch, with Evelyn already awake before the sun, already dressed, already moving through the kitchen with quiet efficiency, while her husband slept in the room across the hall, behind a door she had not knocked on in 3 years. She did not knock anymore. She had learned. The first year she knocked. She told herself he was tired from working the land. She told herself that ranching was hard, that men carried burdens in ways that weren't always visible, that patience was a virtue, a good wife practiced without complaint. She knocked softly, politely, the way she'd been raised to do. She said good morning through the door. She asked if he wanted coffee. She waited. He answered when he answered. Sometimes he didn't answer at all. By the second year, she stopped knocking and simply left his coffee on the kitchen table. By the third year, she stopped waiting for him to drink it before it went cold. By the 7th, she had quietly rearranged her entire existence around the fact that Caleb Thornton would never reach for her first. She told herself she had made peace with that. She was wrong. But she had become very good at pretending. The kitchen was her territory now, the one room in the Thornton house that felt genuinely hers. She had hung dried lavender above the window. She had placed her mother's old crock on the shelf beside the flour tin. Small things. Private things. The kind of small resistance a woman builds when she cannot leave, but cannot fully surrender either. She was rolling biscuit dough when she heard his door open. Her hands kept moving. She had trained herself not to look up. Looking up had been a habit she'd broken in year 2 when she realized that hope was more painful than indifference. Looking up meant watching him cross the kitchen without pausing, without good morning, without any acknowledgement that she was standing 3 feet from him as a human being rather than a piece of furniture. His boots crossed the floor. He stopped at the table. He lifted the coffee she'd set out. He said without looking at her, "We're moving the eastern herd today. I'll be late." "All right," she said. He walked out. The door did not slam. He was not a violent man. The door closed with careful, deliberate quiet, and somehow that was worse that even his departures were controlled, measured, stripped of any emotion that might have accidentally revealed he was still human inside all that stone. Evelyn pressed the heel of her hand into the dough. She did not cry. She had stopped crying over his exits in year 4. By year 7, she had simply grown very, very tired. That was the thing no one outside the Thornton Ranch understood. They saw a prosperous household. They saw a well-maintained property and a capable woman and a man who worked himself to the bone providing for his family. They saw a marriage that functioned, meals on the table accounts, paid a respected name in Willow Creek. What they did not see was the particular kind of exhaustion that came from spending 7 years trying to reach someone who had decided long before you ever arrived that being reached was dangerous. Evelyn had been 19 when she married Caleb Thornton. She was 26 now. She felt 40. Her name was Evelyn May Hartwell, before she became Evelyn Thornton, and the Hartwells of Helena were a respectable family, not wealthy, but decent. The kind of people who paid their debts and held their heads up and married their daughters to men with prospects. Caleb Thornton had prospects. He had 1,000 acres of Montana rangeland, a solid house, and a reputation in Willow Creek as a man who kept his word. Her father had considered it a fine match. At 19, Evelyn had considered it a beginning. She remembered the day of the wedding with perfect clarity. Not because it was romantic, it was not, but because of the way Caleb had looked at her during the ceremony. Not cold, not warm exactly, but something in between, something careful and guarded, like a man assessing a contract he'd agreed to but wasn't entirely sure about. She had told herself that was simply how reserved men looked. She had told herself that love came after. She had been raised to believe that in practical marriages, love grew slowly like a crop in difficult soil. You worked it. You tended it. Eventually, if you were patient and diligent, something green pushed through. She had worked 7 years. Nothing had pushed through. What she hadn't understood at 19, what she understood now in painful bone-deep clarity, was that a crop needed 2 people tending it. One person kneeling in the dirt, while the other walked past without bending, was not a marriage growing. It was a woman wearing herself down for a harvest that would never come. Still, she had stayed. She stayed because leaving was complicated in 1878, because a woman without her husband was a woman without a home, without property, without the specific legal and social protections that marriage provided. She stayed because her father was gone, and her mother was in poor health, and there was nowhere she could go that would not be a humiliation visited on a family that had already given enough. She stayed because part of her, some stubborn, unreasonable, thoroughly inconvenient part of her, still believed that somewhere behind Caleb Thornton's walls there was a man worth waiting for. She hated that part of herself most days. Today was one of those days. Ruth Caldwell arrived at the ranch at 9:30 with a jar of preserved plums and the particular expression of a woman who had something to say and intended to say it. Ruth was the wife of the Thornton Ranch's foreman, Tom Caldwell, and she was the closest thing Evelyn had to a friend on the property, which meant she was the one person who spoke to Evelyn like she was a person rather than the Thornton wife, which were 2 different things, and everyone knew it. "You look gray," Ruth said, setting the plums on the table and looking at Evelyn with the direct, appraising eye of someone who did not waste time on pleasantries when something was obviously wrong. "Good morning to you too," Evelyn said. "I'm serious. When did you last sleep properly?" "I sleep fine." "You sleep the way women sleep, when they're too tired to dream and too proud to complain." Ruth pulled out a chair and sat down without being invited. That was Ruth. Evelyn loved her for it. "Tom says Caleb's been at the Northfields since before dawn, 3 days running. He's moving the eastern herd today." "I know what he's doing with the cattle, Evelyn. I'm asking what he's doing with his wife." The bluntness of it landed like a slap, not cruel, but direct enough to sting. Evelyn set down on the bread she was slicing and turned to face the window. "The same thing he's always done," she said quietly. "Nothing." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long are you going to keep living like this?" "I don't know what you mean." "Yes, you do. You're a young woman. You're not even 30. You're running this house, managing half the accounts, keeping these men fed, and this property functioning, and your husband walks past you in the morning like you're a coat rack." Ruth's voice was not cruel. It was the voice of someone who was angry on behalf of someone who had stopped being angry for herself. "That is not a marriage, Evelyn. That is a sentence." Evelyn turned from the window. "He's not a bad man," she said. It was the thing she always said. She had said it so many times that it had started to sound less like a defense and more like a prayer, a thing repeated to keep something falling apart from falling entirely. "No," Ruth agreed. "He's not a bad man. He's a closed-off, broken, stubborn man who doesn't know how to let anyone in. Those are different things. And understanding the difference hasn't made your life any better, has it?" Evelyn opened her mouth. She closed it, because the honest answer was no. Understanding that Caleb Thornton was wounded, rather than malicious, had not made 7 years of silence any softer. Knowing that his coldness came from somewhere, from loss, from fear, from a childhood she'd heard about only in fragments that he'd let slip, and immediately regretted, had not made his absence any less present. "You could understand a wound, and still bleed from it. I have a good life," Evelyn said finally. "Compared to many women, I have a very good life." Ruth looked at her for a long moment. "You're comparing yourself to misery," she said, "so that you don't have to want more." Evelyn did not respond to that. She poured Ruth's coffee, and they talked about other things. But Ruth's words stayed in her chest for the rest of the day, small and sharp and true. She was in the barn, checking on the older mare, when Hank Dawson found her. Hank was 19, the youngest of the ranch hands, broad-shouldered and enthusiastic in the way of boys who had not yet been worn down by the world. He was also, Evelyn had noticed, the only person on the property who spoke to both her and Caleb with the same easy friendliness, utterly unaware of the cold geography between them. "Mrs. Thornton," Hank said, stopping in the barn doorway and pulling off his hat. "Boss said to let you know the north fence line came down in the night, third post section east of the creek." Evelyn looked up from checking the mare's hoof. "How bad?" "Not bad enough that we lost any cattle, but it needs fixing before dark, or we might lose some come morning." "Does he have the crew he needs for it?" "He said he was going to take Perkins and the 2 Mitchell boys." Evelyn nodded. "Tell him I'll have supper held until 8. Hank hesitated. She looked at him. "What?" He turned his hat in his hands, that particular young man gesture that meant he wanted to say something and wasn't sure if he was allowed. "It's just he said don't bother. About supper." Something in Evelyn's chest went very still. "Don't bother," she repeated. "He said he'd eat with the crew at the fire when the fence was done." Hank had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I'm sorry, ma'am. I'm just telling you what he said." "That's fine, Hank," she said. "Thank you." He left. Evelyn stood in the barn, one hand on the mare's flank, and let the particular quiet of that instruction settle over her. Don't bother. It was such a small thing. Men ate with their crews all the time. There was nothing unusual about it, nothing deliberately unkind. And yet, don't bother. 7 years of small instructions. Like that one. Each of them individually, innocent collectively, adding up to a portrait of a woman who was being told again and again in language that was never quite direct enough to object to that she did not need to be waited for. That her table was not the one that mattered. That her supper, her effort, her presence at the end of the day, was an inconvenience that could be neatly avoided. Don't bother. She made supper anyway. She always made supper anyway. She ate alone at the kitchen table with a book open beside her plate, and when Caleb came in after 9 o'clock smelling of cold air and wood smoke, she was already washing the dishes, and he crossed the kitchen without stopping and went to bed without a word, and the house settled around them like something that had given up. She had a dream that night. She did not remember it fully when she woke. She rarely did. But she remembered the feeling of it, warm and terrible at once, the kind of dream that reminds you of something you've been trying not to want. She remembered reaching for something in the dark. She remembered saying his name. She woke at 2 in the morning with her hand outstretched toward the empty side of her bed. She lay still for a long time. Then she got up, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and sat in the chair by the window while Willow Creek slept and the Montana sky spread its cold stars overhead. And she thought very clearly and very quietly, the thought she had been managing not to think for the better part of a year. She was going to have to leave. Not immediately. Not without a plan. She was not the kind of woman who made decisions in the dark from the raw center of loneliness. But she was going to have to start thinking carefully about what a life outside the Thornton ranch would look like. She had skills. She could keep accounts. She could teach. She was not without options, even if those options were narrow and difficult and required a kind of courage she wasn't sure she had yet. But she was going to have to find it, because Ruth was right, as Ruth was always uncomfortably right. She had been comparing herself to misery to avoid wanting more. And you could only do that for so long before you forgot entirely what wanting felt like. Before you became someone who had been so thoroughly told she didn't matter that she had started to believe it. She was 26 years old. She refused to believe it. She watched the stars for a long time. She did not sleep again until nearly dawn. The following morning she was in the office. Caleb's office technically. But practically, it had become hers in the same quiet way that many things on the Thornton ranch had become hers, through simple application of presence and competence. Caleb was good with land and cattle. He was not good with the correspondence, the accounts, the records of purchase and expense that a property this size generated in continuous demanding volume. 3 years ago, without making anything of it, Evelyn had started managing the paperwork. It was something to do. It made her useful in a way that cooking and cleaning didn't quite satisfy, and being useful, she had discovered, was one of the few ways she could maintain the feeling that she was contributing to something real. She was going through the month's accounts when she found the discrepancy. She almost missed it. It was subtle, the kind of mathematical sleight of hand that required careful attention to catch, which was precisely why she had caught it when no one else had. A payment recorded in the ledger against a vendor in Billings, who, when she cross-referenced the purchase orders, had not provided the goods listed. $340. Not enough to break a ranch this size, but not a rounding error either. An amount deliberate enough to be intentional. She went back through the previous 2 months. Her heart began to beat faster. The same vendor, different amounts. February $280. January $310. 9 months total if the pattern held as far back as she suspected, which meant somewhere between $2,000 and $3,000 had moved out of the Thornton Ranch accounts into a name that didn't correspond to any legitimate goods received. She sat very still. She was not panicking, she was thinking. The question was not just what this was. It was clearly theft or something close enough to it, but who? Who had access to these accounts? Caleb rarely looked at the ledgers himself. She was the one with consistent access. There were 2 other people. James Perkins, the senior ranch hand who'd been with Caleb since before Evelyn arrived, who handled some of the supply ordering. And Daniel Webb, Caleb's business manager in Willow Creek, who oversaw the bank accounts and vendor relationships. She flipped to the purchase orders more carefully. The vendor invoices, the false ones, were signed with a mark she recognized. She stared at it for a long moment. Then she closed the ledger, placed it carefully in the locked drawer where she kept the household accounts, and stood up. She was going to need to be certain before she said anything. She was going to need to be very, very careful, because if she was right, then she was sitting on a secret that was going to shatter the steady, controlled, suffocating peace of the Thornton Ranch, and she was going to have to decide whether to take it to her husband, who barely spoke to her, or handle it herself, which she was increasingly beginning to think she was capable of doing. She stood in the office doorway for a moment. Then she put on her coat and went to find Ruth Caldwell. "You found it in the ledger." Ruth's voice was low, careful. 3 months of falsified invoices at minimum, possibly further back. Evelyn kept her own voice even. She was sitting across from Ruth in the Caldwell kitchen, both of them with their hands around their cups, speaking quietly, even though Tom Caldwell was out with the crew and there was no one to overhear. "I need to know who has been handling the supply orders without Caleb's direct oversight." Ruth looked at her steadily. "You haven't told him?" "Not yet." "Why not?" Evelyn thought about how to answer that honestly. Because telling Caleb meant going to him with something important, meant standing in his office or finding him in the field and saying, "I need to talk to you. I found something serious. I need you to hear me." And she had spent 7 years approaching her husband with things she needed him to hear. She knew what that felt like. She knew the particular experience of watching his eyes go somewhere distant while she was still talking, the way he could be physically present and completely elsewhere, the way being heard by Caleb Thornton required fighting through layers of deliberate removal that were exhausting on a good day. She had things to prove first. She needed to be certain. If she walked into Caleb Thornton's orbit saying someone is stealing from you, and she turned out to be wrong, she would have no credibility left at all. Less than she had now, which was already very little. "I need documentation," she said. "I need more than what I have." Ruth studied her. "You think it's Perkins?" It wasn't a question. "I think the signature on the false invoices matches his mark," Evelyn said carefully. "I think someone has been working this particular fraud for at least 9 months, and possibly longer. And I think whoever did it believed that no one was watching the accounts closely enough to catch it." "And they were wrong," Ruth said. "They were wrong," Evelyn agreed. Ruth leaned back in her chair and looked at the window for a moment. Then she looked back at Evelyn with an expression that was complicated admiration and worry both at once. "Evelyn," she said, "if you're right about this, Perkins has been with Caleb since they were both young men. He is one of Caleb's oldest—" "I know. If you go to Caleb with this and he doesn't believe you, I know that too. Then what are you going to do? Evelyn lifted her coffee cup. I'm going to make sure I have everything he cannot possibly dispute, she said. And then I'm going to walk into that room and make him hear me whether he wants to or not. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then softly, good. She worked for 3 days on the documentation. She was precise and systematic about it, the way she was about everything she decided was worth doing. Pulling records, cross-referencing dates, writing everything out in the clear, organized hand she used for the household accounts, so that it was undeniable on paper, a sequence of facts laid out so logically that even someone who didn't want to believe it would have difficulty finding purchase for their doubt. At the end of 3 days, she had 6 months of falsified invoices, a clear pattern of amounts, dates, and signatures, and a calculation that put the total closer to $2,400, a sum large enough she knew to matter. The morning of the 4th day, she went to find her husband. He was in the barn. She had rehearsed this. She had rehearsed the words on the walk across the yard, arranging them in the clearest possible order, leading with the evidence rather than the accusation, presenting it as information he needed rather than something she needed him to respond to a particular way. She had rehearsed being calm. She had rehearsed the part where he might react with skepticism, and the part where he might be dismissive, and the part where he might look at her the way he always looked at her, like she was a polite inconvenience that required managing. She stepped into the barn. Caleb was checking the rigging on his saddle. He looked up when she came in. He did not say anything. He waited in that particular way of his, not unkind, but contained, held in, and she walked to where he was standing and set the ledger and her documentation on the rail beside him. There's something in the accounts you need to see, she said. He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face, not quite surprise, but a change in the quality of his attention. What is it? He said. Someone has been filing false invoices against a Billings vendor account for at least 6 months, possibly longer. She opened the ledger to the first marked page. The total, I can confirm, is just under $2,500. The signature on the invoices is Perkins's mark. The silence that followed was the loudest silence she had experienced in 7 years of quiet. Caleb did not look at the ledger immediately. He looked at her. And for a moment, just a moment, something happened behind his eyes that she had not seen before. Not anger, not dismissal. Something she couldn't quite name, an expression that was too quick and too complex and too carefully controlled to read before it was already gone. Then he looked at the ledger. He picked it up. I went through the pages she'd marked. The barn was very quiet. When he finally set it down, his jaw was set and his hands were still, and he was looking at something she couldn't see. You found this yourself, he said. Not a question. Yes. How long have you been keeping the accounts? 3 years. Another silence. I didn't know that, he said. No, she said. You didn't. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she turned and walked back to the house, and behind her, the barn was very, very quiet, and she did not look back, and she did not let herself feel anything about the particular careful way he had said I didn't know that until she was back in her kitchen, with the door closed behind her. She stood at the sink. She breathed. And she thought he heard me. He actually heard me. She did not know what to do with that. She had not planned for it. He heard her. That was the thing Evelyn kept returning to in the hours after she walked out of that barn. Not what he'd said. Not the way he'd held the ledger. Not even the expression that had crossed his face before he locked it back down again. Just the simple, stunning fact of it. He had heard her. She did not sleep well that night. Not because she was anxious. The fear of confronting him had replaced by something stranger and harder to name. But because she kept running through the moment in the barn, the way you run your tongue over a tooth that's been aching so long, you've forgotten what normal feels like. She was checking something. She wasn't sure what. She was up before 4. She told herself it was habit. She was in the kitchen with the stove lit and the coffee on when she heard his door. Her hands went still on the bread tin. His boots crossed the hall. The kitchen door opened. And then, for the first time in longer than she could clearly remember, Caleb Thornton stepped into the kitchen and did not move toward the table to collect his coffee and leave. He stopped in the middle of the room, and when she turned, he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen in 7 years of marriage. Uncertain. Carefully. Uncertain the way a man looks when he's standing at the edge of something and doesn't trust the ground. "I went back through the accounts last night," he said. "All right," she said. She kept her voice level. She had learned long ago not to hand him her reactions before she knew what he was going to do with them. "The pattern goes back 14 months. She turned fully to face him. "How much?" "Just over $4,000. The number landed in her chest, like a stone dropping into still water. She had suspected the fraud went further back than 6 months, but $4,000 was a figure that changed things considerably. On a ranch the size of Thornton's, it was not ruinous. But it was serious. It was the kind of money that said, this was not impulsive, not opportunistic, not a man who'd helped himself once in a moment of weakness. This was deliberate, and sustained, and patient. "Perkins," she said. "Perkins," he confirmed. He looked like a man who had spent the night with a fact he didn't want, and had not yet found a way to make peace with it. James Perkins had been with Caleb since Caleb was 17 years old. That was 20 years. That was longer than their marriage by 13 years. That was the kind of loyalty that wasn't supposed to have a price, and finding out that it did, that it had in fact had a very specific and calculable price, was something Evelyn understood would hit a man like Caleb Thornton in a place that had nothing to do with money. "I'm sorry," she said. And she meant it, not the performative apology of someone being polite, but the real thing, the kind you offer when someone is hurt in a way you recognize, even if you can't entirely explain why you recognize it. He looked at her. It was the longest he had looked directly at her in years, and she held herself very still under it, the way you hold still when something wild and cautious is considering whether to trust you. "You should have been the one to find this," he said finally. She wasn't sure what that meant. She waited. "I should have known you were managing the accounts," he said. "I should have. I didn't ask." "No," she agreed. "I assumed Perkins had someone in town reviewing them. He was reviewing them himself, which is likely how this went on as long as it did." Caleb made a sound that was not quite a word, low in his throat. The sound a man makes when he understands something unpleasant in full for the first time. He pulled out the chair across from her chair. Technically the one she always used, and then seemed to realize that, and stopped. "Sit down," she said. "Please." He sat. She poured his coffee and set it in front of him, and then sat down herself, and they were at the same table at the same time, in a way that was not accidental, not just proximity and passing, but deliberate, two people both choosing to be in the same place and not leave. Evelyn could not remember the last time that had happened. "What do you want to do about it?" she asked. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "I need to speak with him." "Before you speak with him," she said carefully, "you should have the bank records pulled. The invoices I found are the ranch copies. If the Billings vendor account is fictional, and I believe it is, then there should be no corresponding records on the bank side. That confirms it before he has any opportunity to offer an explanation that accounts for part of it." I was looking at her again with that same quality of attention she'd felt in the barn, like he was seeing her and trying to reckon with the fact that he hadn't been for a long time. "That's right," he said. "That's the right order. I can write out the documentation you'll need to take to the bank." "You already have documentation?" "I have the ranch records. The bank is separate." He nodded slowly. "All right." They sat with their coffee. The silence between them was different this morning. It was still quiet. They were both people of few words in their own ways, but it was not the emptiness she was used to. It was the quiet of two people with something between them. Something shared. Even if what they were sharing was only a problem, and a cup of coffee, and a morning that was still trying to decide what it was going to be. "How long have you known something was wrong?" he asked. She considered the question honestly. "I found the first discrepancy 4 days ago. I spent 3 days confirming it before I came to you." "Why didn't you come to me immediately?" She held his gaze. "Because I needed to be certain, and because I wasn't sure you would hear me if I came to you without proof." The silence that followed, that was different again. Not comfortable, but honest. She had said a true thing plainly. The kind of true thing that had nowhere to hide in the space between them, and he was sitting with it in a way she hadn't expected him to, without deflecting, without the polite closed-off removal she was so accustomed to. "That's fair," he said. 2 words. Simple. Quiet. But in 7 years of marriage, Caleb Thornton had never once looked at her across a shared table and said that something she felt was fair. She breathed carefully. "I'll have the bank documentation written up this morning," she said. "You can take it to town this afternoon." He nodded. He finished his coffee. He did not immediately leave. That was new too. He sat for another few minutes with his empty cup, looking at his own hands, and she worked quietly beside him and tried very hard not to read anything into it, because she had been burned by reading things into Caleb Thornton's behavior before, and she was not the kind of woman who made the same mistake twice. But she noticed. She always noticed everything. She just couldn't always afford to feel it. He left for town after the morning feeding was done. He took her documentation. He did not thank her before he went, but as he crossed the kitchen toward the door, he stopped and said without turning around, "I'll be back by dark." She looked up from the desk. He had never said that before. He had said he would be late. He had said don't bother. He had communicated his absences and arrivals the way you communicate with a housekeeper efficiently and without personal color. He had never said I'll be back by dark in the way that meant you do not need to wonder. "All right," she said. He went out. She sat very still at the desk for a moment. Then she put her head down and went back to work. She was not going to let herself feel too much about a man she had given up feeling things about. She was not going to mistake 2 mornings of changed behavior for a changed man. She had been down that road before, years 2 and 3, when she had told herself that surely something was shifting. Surely he was trying only to find that she had been imagining growth in a man who was simply having a slightly better week. She knew better now. She was 26 years old, and she knew better. She told herself that firmly, and went back to the accounts. She told herself that 4 times before noon. She didn't entirely believe herself any of the 4 times. Hank Dawson found her at the fence line just after midday. She had taken herself outside after finishing the documentation, needing air and movement, and the particular kind of quiet that came from being around animals rather than inside her own head. She was checking the older fence posts along the south pasture, a task she'd been meaning to get to for a week, when Hank appeared at a pace that told her before he opened his mouth that something had happened. "Mrs. Thornton," he said, stopping short and pulling his hat off. "Perkins is gone." She turned from the fence. "What do you mean gone?" "His gear's not in the bunkhouse. His horse is gone. Tom Caldwell went to get him for the afternoon feed, and the bunkhouse was empty." Hank's face was young and troubled, and trying to look older than it was. "Looks like he left sometime in the night." Evelyn's mind moved quickly and clearly, the way it did when she needed it to. Perkins had been here yesterday when she and Caleb had spoken in the barn, which meant either someone had told him what she'd found, or he'd somehow known the ledger had been pulled. Either way, he had been watching. He had been watching, and he'd understood the way people who are doing something they know is wrong always have a particular antenna for the moment they've been found out. "Has anyone told Mr. Thornton?" "He's in town, ma'am. Tom's trying to get word to him." "All right." She made herself think clearly. "Make sure all the cash in the house safe is accounted for. Check the equipment shed. I want to know if anything beyond his horse is missing. And tell Tom to keep this quiet with the rest of the crew until Mr. Thornton gets back." Hank blinked. "Yes, ma'am." "Go." He went. She stood at the fence line for a moment, the wind coming across the south pasture cold and insistent, and she thought about James Perkins, who had been with Caleb since they were both young men, who had eaten at Caleb's table and worked Caleb's land and called himself Caleb's friend, and who had spent 14 months helping himself to Caleb's money in small patient increments, banking on the certainty that no one was watching carefully enough to see. He had been wrong about that, but Caleb was going to feel this in a way that had nothing to do with $4,000. She walked back to the house to wait. Caleb came back from town at 4 in the afternoon, 2 hours before she expected him, which told her that Tom Caldwell's word had reached him quickly. She heard his horse in the yard, heard him speaking to someone. Tom's voice answering low and serious. And then the kitchen door opened, and he came in with mud on his boots and something in his face that she had not seen before. Not anger, not exactly. It was more like the expression of a man who has had a foundational belief removed without warning. She was at the kitchen table with a fresh pot of coffee. She had made it 10 minutes ago, some instinct telling her to have it ready. He sat down across from her without being invited. She poured his coffee. He said, "The bank confirmed it. 41 months. She kept her face very still. 41 months. 3.5 years. His voice was quiet in a way that was different from his usual quiet. That quiet was controlled. This was the quiet of something that has been cut through. He started 8 months after I put him in charge of the supply accounts. Evelyn set the coffee pot down carefully. I didn't find it going back that far. You found what was there to find, Caleb said. He'd been more careful in the early months, smaller amounts, less frequent. He looked at his hands. He got careless. He got comfortable, she said. He looked up at her. People who get away with something long enough start to believe they'll always get away with it, she said. He stopped being careful because he stopped believing anyone was watching. He was right, Caleb said. No one was watching, except you. The weight of that landed between them. She let it sit. What will you do? She asked. The sheriff in town has the bank records now. There's a warrant for his arrest. He rubbed one hand over his jaw. He has maybe a 4-hour lead, probably more. He'll run far. He should. Something in his voice that was not quite anger and not quite grief, and was perhaps the specific pain that came from feeling both at once. I trusted that man with things beyond the accounts. I trusted him with the crew. I trusted his judgment on the North Range decisions. He stopped. He reset himself visibly, the way he reset everything, pulling it back, pulling it down. It doesn't matter. It does matter, she said. He looked at her, a flicker of something behind his eyes. Being betrayed by someone you trusted matters, she said. You don't have to diminish that. The kitchen was quiet. He was looking at her with that quality of attention again, but this time there was something different in it, rawer maybe, or just less defended. Like a man who had run out of energy for maintaining the distance and had momentarily forgotten to reconstruct it. I've spent most of the day trying to understand how I missed it, he said. You were managing the land and the cattle. You delegated the accounts. I delegated them to the wrong person. You delegated them to someone you had every reason to trust based on 20 years of history. That's not a failure of intelligence, Caleb. That's a man being human. He stared at her. She had not used his name directly in, she couldn't remember how long. She used it occasionally in practical contexts, but not like that. Not in a sentence that was specifically aimed at him as a person, rather than a rancher who needed information. The strangeness of it registered on his face and disappeared before it fully surfaced, the way he swallowed everything, but she'd seen it. You're being generous, he said. I'm being accurate, she said. There's a difference. He lifted his coffee cup. He drank in silence for a moment, and she sat across from him and let the silence do what silence did between them. Except this silence felt like something being shared, rather than something being imposed, which was new enough that she was paying attention to every texture of it. Ruth Caldwell came to see me this morning, he said unexpectedly. Evelyn looked up. When? After I came back from town. She came to find me in the yard. He paused. She told me I should thank you. Evelyn set down her cup. You don't need to thank me. I manage these accounts. It was my responsibility to... That's not what she meant, he said. She stopped. He was looking at his coffee cup again, not at her, the way he always looked at objects when he was trying to say something that cost him something. She said you've been managing this place for years, he said. Not just the accounts, the household, the crew, the suppliers, the schedules. She said if half of what she sees is true, this ranch has been running on your work as much as mine for at least 3 years, and I've been... He stopped again. I've been absent. The word he used was absent. She felt it in her chest, unexpected and precisely aimed. You were working the land, she said carefully. Don't do that, he said. He looked up at her. Don't make excuses for me. I've been giving myself excuses for 7 years. She did not breathe. I don't know how to say this without saying it plainly, he said, and his voice had something in it she hadn't heard before, something stripped of its usual control, raw at the edges. I have not been a good husband to you. The kitchen held that sentence. She felt it the way you feel cold water, sudden total arriving before you've braced for it. Caleb. I'm not asking you to argue with that, he said. I'm not asking you to tell me I've been fine. Because you have been alone in this house for 7 years, and I was here the entire time, and that is not fine. She opened her mouth. She closed it. Because he was right, and she had spent so long softening the truth of it for both their sakes, that she wasn't sure she knew anymore how to simply receive it when it was offered plain. What brought this on? She said finally. Not a question exactly, more like thinking out loud. This morning, he said. You sitting across the table from me and telling me you hadn't come to me sooner because you weren't sure I'd hear you. He looked at her steadily. That's what brought it on. A woman who has lived in my house for 7 years and managed my ranch for 3 of them and found a fraud that saved me thousands of dollars, and she didn't know if I would hear her. The silence was enormous. She did not fill it. She had learned over years of navigating conversations that went nowhere, when to speak, and when to let something breathe. And this needed breathing room. This was a man who did not say things like this, who had possibly never said things like this, and she was not going to make the mistake of rushing in to manage it before she understood what it was. I hear that, she said finally. He nodded. Neither of them spoke for a minute. I'm not promising anything, he said. I don't know how to promise things I don't know if I can keep. Good, she said. He looked up. I wouldn't trust a promise right now, she said. I'd wonder what you wanted from it. Something shifted in his face, not offense, something stranger, like recognition. Fair, he said. What I'd trust, she said, is whether tomorrow morning you're in this kitchen or you're not. He held her gaze for a long moment. I'll be here, he said. She picked up her cup. Then we'll see, she said. He stayed at the table long enough to finish his second cup of coffee, and when he left to speak with Tom Caldwell about the crew, he did something she would not understand the full weight of until later that night when she sat down to think about it. He said at the kitchen door, not as an afterthought, not as a courtesy. He stopped, and he turned, and he said, Evelyn, thank you, for finding it, for finding all of it. She heard him cross the yard. She sat down at the kitchen table. She breathed. She told herself that 2 mornings of changed behavior were not a changed man. She told herself that practical problems created temporary intimacies that evaporated when the problem was resolved. She told herself that she had been building a plan to leave this ranch, a careful, reasonable plan, and that 2 cups of coffee shared across a table and the unexpected gift of being heard did not erase 7 years of silence. She told herself all of this. She told herself it 3 times with her hands flat on the table and her eyes on the window. And then Ruth Caldwell was in the kitchen door, hat off, slightly out of breath, with the expression of a woman who has news she both wants and dreads to deliver. You need to hear this, Ruth said. What now? Perkins didn't run alone. Evelyn went very still. Webb, Ruth said. Daniel Webb, Caleb's business manager in town. The one who handled the bank accounts. The sheriff went to bring him in for questioning and found his office emptied and locked. Ruth's voice was level, the level of someone delivering hard news to someone they respect. Webb and Perkins left together. The bank manager recognized Webb's handwriting on 2 of the false invoices. Evelyn stared at her. This isn't just a ranch hand helping himself to the supply accounts, Ruth said quietly. This was organized, from both ends. Evelyn stood up. Where's Caleb? In the yard with Tom. I need to tell him. Evelyn. The bank records he pulled this afternoon. Evelyn said, her mind already moving fast ahead of the words. If Webb was involved from the bank side, then the documentation Caleb gave the sheriff today may not be complete. There may be accounts we don't know exist. Transfers that didn't go through the main ledger. She was moving toward the door. If there are accounts we don't know about, then the total loss isn't $4,000. Ruth moved out of her way. If there are accounts we don't know about, Evelyn said, then we don't yet know what has actually been taken. She went out into the cold and crossed the yard and found her husband, and she told him the rest of it standing in the last of the daylight, with her hands steady and her voice clear, and she watched his face take the hit. Not the money, not the numbers, but the full scope of it, the years of deliberate planning. The two men working both ends, the systematic patience of it, and she did not look away from him, and she did not soften it. She told him the truth. Because someone had to, and she was the one who was watching. He looked at her for a long moment when she finished. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "first thing I need you to go back through every account you have access to. Everything. Find whatever else there is to find." "I will," she said. He nodded once. He did not look away. "I mean it," he said quietly. "All of it. I need to know everything, and I need you to be the one to tell me." She held his gaze. "I know," she said, and standing there in the cold Montana dusk, with fraud and betrayal, and the wreckage of a trusted friendship spread between them. Evelyn Thornton felt something she had not felt in this marriage in a very long time. She felt like she was standing on solid ground. Not because anything was resolved. Not because the man in front of her had become someone different in the space of a day. Not because she had forgiven 7 years of silence over 2 cups of coffee and a shared problem. But because he had asked her to be the one. He had looked at her actually looked, and he had said, "I need you to be the one." And whatever that meant, or didn't mean, whatever it led to, or failed to lead to it, was the first time in 7 years that Caleb Thornton had named her, not as a wife by duty, but as the person he needed. She was not done being careful. She was not done building her plan. But she was listening now in the same way he was finally listening, one day at a time, and with both eyes open. She went back inside. She started pulling accounts. She worked until the candle burned low. The accounts were spread across the desk in the order she'd learned to arrange them. Ranch ledger on the left, bank correspondence on the right. The purchase records she'd been pulling from the supply chest, stacked in the middle by month and year. She had a system. She had always had a system, even when no one knew it existed, even when the only person who benefited from her precision was the ranch itself, which did not say thank you. What she found in the first 2 hours was bad enough. What she found in the third hour was worse. There was a second account she hadn't known about, a holding account in a different bank, not the main Willow Creek branch, but a smaller institution 40 miles east in Clearwater. The correspondence was buried in a folder she'd assumed contained old land deeds mixed in deliberately. She suspected with documents that no one would have reason to pull. She found it because she was looking for everything the way Caleb had asked her to, turning over every piece of paper in every drawer, with the systematic patience that had always been her best quality and her loneliest one. The account held $6,200. She sat with that number for a moment. Then she wrote it down very clearly at the top of a clean page, because the act of writing it in her own precise hand made it real in a way that helped her think rather than simply feel. $6,200 plus the $4,000 from the main accounts brought the total theft to somewhere over $10,000. A figure that was not going to ruin the Thornton Ranch. Caleb had built carefully over 20 years, and the land itself was worth considerably more. But a figure that represented, she calculated, nearly 2 full years of operating expenses. That was not an inconvenience. That was a deliberate, calculated gutting. She heard the clock in the hall strike 11. She heard something else, a sound from across the hall. Not footsteps, not a door. Just the particular quality of presence that a house has when someone is awake in it who wasn't awake a moment ago. She had learned to read the Thornton house the way you learn to read any space you've inhabited for years, its sounds and silences, and the way different hours felt in it. At 11 at night, the house was usually as still as a held breath. Tonight it wasn't. She set down her pen. She crossed the hall. Caleb's door was not fully closed. It was open 2 inches, the way it was sometimes when he'd come in late and tired and not pulled it fully to. She stopped in the hall and almost turned back. She had a rule about his door, a rule she'd built for herself in year 2 and maintained since, because a woman who knocked on a closed door and was not answered learned quickly that the kindest thing she could do for herself was stop knocking. But his light was on. She could see it through the 2-inch gap, a low, warm glow. She stood in the hall for a moment caught between the rule and something she didn't have a name for yet. She knocked. A beat of silence. Then, "Come in." She pushed the door open. Howe was sitting at the small desk in the corner of his room, still dressed with papers in front of him. His own papers. She saw correspondence she didn't recognize. He looked up when she came in, and his face did the thing it had been doing for 2 days now, that shift in quality, like something adjusting its focus. "I found another account," she said. She did not stand in the doorway. She walked in because standing in doorways was what you did when you weren't sure you were welcome, and she was deciding right now that she was done with that. She set the page with the Clearwater account details on the desk in front of him. Clearwater Savings and Trust. The correspondence was buried with the land deed records. He looked at the page. She watched him read the number. 6,000, he said. 6,200 and change, she said. Combined with the main accounts, the total is between $10,000 and $11,000. He sat very still. She had expected anger, or the particular contained quality that passed for anger in Caleb Thornton. What she hadn't expected was what she got instead, which was something quieter and more exposed than anything she'd seen on his face in 7 years of marriage. He looked like a man who had been hit somewhere he didn't know was unprotected. "That's 3.5 years of my life in these accounts," he said. "I know. That's the North Pasture expansion. I delayed twice because the numbers didn't support it." He looked up at her. "I thought I was being too conservative. I thought I was miscalculating the margins." A pause, and then flat with the weight of it. "I was miscalculating because the money wasn't there. Because they were taking it." She held his gaze and did not say anything, because sometimes the right thing was not a response but simply being present while someone understood the full scope of a thing they hadn't wanted to understand. "Sit down," he said. She sat. They went through the Clearwater documents together side by side at the small desk, their voices low in the late-hour quiet of the house, and it was the longest sustained conversation they had shared in 7 years of marriage. Not personal, not the conversation about feelings and histories and the cold distance between them, but a working conversation. Two people thinking through the same problem from the same side, and there was something in that particular shared direction, that felt like the first real thing they had done together since before she could remember. I had questions. She had answers. When she didn't, she said so plainly. Around midnight, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands. And for a moment, he looked not like Caleb Thornton the rancher, but like a man who was very tired and had been for longer than he would ever admit to anyone. "I need to go to Clearwater tomorrow," he said. "The bank will have records of the transactions. Who authorized the withdrawals, who received the funds. Webb handled the correspondence from the main account," she said. "If he was involved in the Clearwater account as well, his name should be on the authorization signatures. I want you to come with me." She looked at him. "To Clearwater," he said, as if she'd misheard, rather than simply not expected it. "I want you with me when I speak to the bank. You understand these documents better than I do, and if there's something in the records I'm missing, I need someone who will actually see it." She looked at him for a moment longer. "All right," she said. "We'd leave at first light." "I'll be ready." He nodded. She gathered her papers and stood, and she was at the door when he said her name. Not with the distant utility of daily coordination, with weight. "Evelyn," she turned. I was still looking at her from the desk, and whatever careful engineering he usually maintained over his expression had been worn down by midnight and exhaustion and 10,000 stolen dollars, and 2 days of a marriage that had started cautiously to behave differently than it had for 7 years. "I don't know how this got this bad," he said. "The ranch, I mean. The accounts." He stopped, and then more quietly, "All of it." She understood that all of it was not just about Perkins and Webb. She stood in the doorway of his room for the first time in 3 years. "I think," she said carefully, "that things get bad gradually, the same way they get better. one small decision at a time, until one day you look up and you're somewhere entirely different from where you meant to be. He held her gaze. Yes, he said. That's exactly right. She went back across the hall. She did not sleep immediately. She lay in her bed and looked at the ceiling and tried to be rational about what was happening, which was difficult because she was not sure she trusted her own rationality where Caleb Thornton was concerned. Not after 7 years of hoping in small increments and being consistently disappointed. She had learned to protect herself. She had learned to keep her own counsel and not invest in changes that might not hold. But she was thinking about the way he'd said her name. She was thinking about the desk they'd sat at together and the ease with which they'd worked. How naturally her answers had fit his questions, as though they were built to think through things together and had simply spent 7 years not knowing it. She closed her eyes. She did not mean to dream, but she did. She did not know in the morning what the dream had been. She knew only that she had not woken sad. They left for Clearwater at sunrise, just the two of them, which was itself a strangeness. She felt the entire 40 miles. She had traveled with Caleb before into Willow Creek, for supplies occasionally further for cattle business, but always in the context of practical necessity, side by side in the wagon seat, with nothing between them but cold air and the sounds of the road. This was different. This was something they were going together on purpose. This was a problem they shared, and sharing a problem she was discovering had a kind of intimacy to it that was different from, and perhaps more durable than anything softer. He drove. She had the documents in a satchel on her lap, and she reviewed them as they went, occasionally saying something about what she expected to find, or what questions she thought the bank would ask, and he listened to everything without interrupting, which was not a quality she had previously associated with him. About 20 miles in, he said out of nowhere, "Tell me about the books." She looked up from the satchel. "What? You read a great deal," he said. "I've noticed. You're always there are books in the kitchen, books in the office, books everywhere. I don't know what you read." She stared at him. It was such a small question. It was also a question he had never asked in 7 years. A question that required him to have noticed her as a person with interior habits and preferences, and a life that existed in the hours when she was not managing his household. It required him to be curious about her specifically. "History mostly," she said. "Some philosophy. Fiction when I can find something worth reading." She paused. "My mother used to have a subscription to a periodical from New York. Essays, criticism, some fiction. I read those growing up. I've tried to keep up with it when the supply riders come through from Billings." "Do they come through often enough?" "Not really." Something loosened in her slightly as she spoke about it, the slight release that comes from being asked about something you love by someone who hasn't asked before. "I've read most of what I have multiple times." "If I subscribe to it," he said, "the periodical, would the Billings supplier carry it?" She looked at him. I was looking at the road, both hands on the reins, face forward, and the question was asked in the same tone he used to discuss cattle and accounts, practical, unembellished. As though ordering a subscription to a literary periodical for his wife was a purely logistical matter with no feeling attached to it. She understood suddenly and with total clarity that this was how he did things. This was how a man who didn't know how to say, "I notice you, and I want to give you something," said it anyway. Not in words designed to move you. In a subscription to a New York periodical. In asking the right supply rider. In the particular practical language of a man who felt things he had no vocabulary for and had found slowly another way to say them. She felt something shift in her chest that she had no intention of examining out loud. "Probably," she said. "You'd have to ask Hendricks when we're next in Willow Creek." "I'll ask him next week," he said. She looked back down at her documents. She did not say thank you. She understood somehow that thank you would embarrass him, would put a name on what he was doing that he wasn't ready to have named. So she simply accepted it, and they drove the rest of the miles in a silence that was different from every other silence they had ever kept together. The Clearwater Bank manager was a man named Archibald Norse, soft-spoken and careful, and visibly uncomfortable from the moment they walked through his door, which told Evelyn before a word was spoken that he knew something and wasn't certain how much trouble knowing it would cost him. Caleb did the initial speaking. He explained what they were there for: the false accounts, the fraud, the connection to Daniel Webb. He was direct and controlled the way he was with everything, and Norse listened with his hands flat on his desk and his expression doing the complicated work of a man deciding in real time how forthcoming to be. Then Caleb put the Clearwater account documents on the desk. Norse looked at them, and Evelyn, watching him, saw what she'd been watching, for the almost imperceptible adjustment, the slight settling of a man who has just understood that the person across from him knows more than he hoped. "I'll need to check our records," Norse said. "We'll wait," Caleb said. Norse went into the back. Caleb sat with his arms on the desk and his face still and patient. Evelyn sat beside him and studied the account documents again, not because she needed to, but because looking at the documents gave her hands something to do while she thought. She was thinking about the authorization signatures. She had not mentioned to Caleb yet that one of them had struck her as unusual. Webb's signature appeared on most of the withdrawals as expected, but on the three largest amounts over $800 each, there was a second signature she didn't recognize. A counter-signature, which meant these particular withdrawals had required two authorizing parties, which meant someone else had known, someone with signing authority on this account. She was still thinking about that when Norse came back with a leather ledger and set it on the desk in front of Caleb with the careful movement of a man laying something down he'd rather not have touched. Caleb opened it. He found the authorization page. He looked at it for a long moment without speaking. Then he slid it across to Evelyn. She looked at the signatures. Webb's on the left for every transaction, and on the right, for the three largest withdrawals, a second signature she recognized immediately with a lurch in her stomach that she kept entirely off her face. The signature read, Calvin A. Hargrove. She looked up at Caleb. His jaw was set. His eyes were still on the ledger. She could see the muscles in his throat working. Calvin Hargrove was the county land commissioner. He was also, she knew from the Willow Creek social fabric she had quietly observed for 7 years, one of the men who had been present at Caleb's father's funeral 20 years ago. One of the men Caleb had spoken of in those rare unguarded moments years back as someone his father had trusted. This was not just fraud. This was a pattern. She looked at Norse. "When was this account opened?" she said. 4 years ago this April, Norse said. He looked as though he would rather be anywhere else on earth. "Who initiated the opening?" "Mr. Webb brought the paperwork. Commissioner Hargrove co-signed the account establishment. And your institution raised no concerns about a county official co-signing a private holding account." Norse's hands moved on the desk. "Commissioner Hargrove carries considerable standing in this county, Mrs. Thornton. We had no reason to." "You had no reason to look," she said, keeping her voice even. "That's different," Caleb said very quietly. "Did Hargrove make any withdrawals himself?" Norse looked at the ledger. He did not want to answer. He answered anyway. 3. In the past 18 months. The room was very still. Evelyn looked at her husband. Caleb was not looking at the ledger anymore. He was looking at the wall with the expression of a man recalculating something enormous, not the money she understood, not even entirely the betrayal. Something larger than that. Something that had to do with the shape of his life, and who had been moving through it, and why, and the particular vertigo of understanding that a wound you thought was one size is actually much, much deeper. "I'd like copies of these records," Caleb said. "All of them." "Of course," Norse said. They waited. Evelyn did not touch Caleb's arm. She did not say anything. She simply stayed beside him in the quiet room while the bank clerk copied the records, and when the copies came, she organized them in the satchel with her other documents, and when they walked out into the cold, Clearwater air. Caleb stopped on the steps and stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked at something only he could see. She stood beside him. "Hargrove has been handling the northern land assessments for this county for 12 years, Caleb said. "I know. He set the property valuations on 3 ranches east of the creek last summer. 2 of them were undervalued." He turned to look at her. "I thought it was incompetence. I thought it was a man who had been at his job too long." "It wasn't incompetence," she said. "No." He turned back. "It wasn't incompetence at all. She thought about the two undervalued ranches east of the creek. Both of them had gone to sale within 6 months of the assessment. Both of them had sold below market. And the buyer, she was pulling this from memory, from conversations overheard at Willow Creek social gatherings, from the particular attentiveness she had cultivated in rooms where no one thought to watch what the quiet woman was paying attention to the buyer. In both cases had been a land development interest out of Billings. She said this to Caleb. He looked at her with an expression that was something between admiration and the sober recognition of a man who has just understood that what he thought was his problem is actually a much larger problem. "Who else do you think knows?" she asked. "I don't know." He was quiet for a moment. "Hargrove has been a commissioner for 12 years. If he's been doing this for 12 years, then it's not just the Thornton Ranch." "No," he said. "It's not just the Thornton Ranch." The implications of that spread out between them, and Evelyn felt it, the shift from a private injury to something that extended into the county itself, into the legal and financial infrastructure that people like Hargrove were trusted to steward honestly and had been corrupting instead. "You'll need a lawyer," she said. "Weston in Billings." "Is Weston trustworthy?" He looked at her. "What makes you ask that?" "Because if Hargrove's reach extends to Billings, which it might given the land development interest, you need to be certain your legal counsel is not connected to the same interests." She paused. "Do you have any reason to trust Weston independently of his professional reputation?" Caleb thought about it. Genuinely thought about it. She could see the process in his face, not dismissing the question, not taking it as a slight to his judgment, but actually weighing it. "He represented my father," Caleb said, "before my father died, over a property dispute that went against some significant local interests. He didn't fold." He paused. "That's the only thing I have." "That's something," she said. "It's not nothing." "No." He looked at her. "You think clearly. Under pressure you think clearly." She held his gaze. "Someone in this marriage has to." It was out before she'd decided to say it. Direct, perhaps too direct, carrying 7 years in it. She watched his face take it, not flinch exactly, but receive it the way he'd been receiving things these past 2 days, without deflecting. "Yes," he said, "someone has to." They drove back to Willow Creek in a different silence from the one they'd driven out in. This silence had weight. It had the specific gravity of two people who have stood in the same place and looked at the same large and serious thing, and understand that whatever was between them before, they are now on the same side of something real. He sent a wire to Weston from the Willow Creek telegraph office before they left for the ranch. She waited in the wagon. When he came back out, he climbed up beside her and picked up the reins, and then before he set the horses moving, he turned and looked at her in a way that was entirely direct. "I want to tell you something," he said. She waited. "The night you went to bed sick," he said. 2 weeks ago, when you pushed yourself too hard through the cold week and you were feverish for 2 days. He stopped, reformulated. "I sat outside your door that night." She stared at him. "For about an hour," he said. "I heard you moving restless. I wanted to make sure you were all right. I didn't knock. I told myself you didn't need me standing in your doorway making things strange." He looked at the reins in his hands. "I sat on the floor in the hall until the house went quiet." She did not say anything. Her heart was doing something she had not given it permission to do. "I heard you say something," he said. "In your sleep. I couldn't tell what it was, but the sound of it." He stopped again, and she could see the effort it was taking him, this man who had spent his entire life treating speech as a last resort to find the words for something he'd been carrying. "The sound of it has been sitting with me since." She thought about the dream she didn't remember. She thought about waking with her hand outstretched toward the empty side of the bed. "Caleb," she said. And there was something in the way she said it, not the flat utility of daily life, not the careful distance she'd maintained for years, but something open and undefended and frightened in its own right that made him turn and look at her. "I'm scared," she said. "Of this. Of whatever this is." "I know," he said. "I have been very careful for a very long time," she said. "I have been careful because I could not afford not to be." I know that too. What you're doing right now, she said. Whatever you're trying to do, I need you to understand that I have a very short supply of hope left on the subject of this marriage, and if you ask me to use it and then go back to the way things were. I'm not going back, he said. You don't know that. You think you know that. But you've been behind your walls for so long, you may not realize how quickly you can retreat into them when something frightens you. He held her gaze. Then tell me, he said. When I retreat, tell me. Don't go quiet. Don't protect me from it. Tell me directly. She searched his face. And you'll hear me, she said. I'll hear you, he said. I give you my word. She held that for a moment. Caleb Thornton's word on a subject that had nothing to do with land or cattle or money. His word on something that cost him. Then I'm going to hold you to that, she said. Good, he said. He set the horses moving. They rode the rest of the way home in the gathering dark. And the night came down over the Montana range cold and clear, and in the Thornton house across the hall from each other. 2 separate lamps burned into the late hours, one for documents and account records, and the careful legal architecture of putting things right, and one for the equally careful, equally necessary work of a man who had sat outside a door for an hour and was trying for the first time in a very long time to find his way through it. The wire from Weston arrived 3 days later. Evelyn was at the desk when Hank brought it in from the Willow Creek Rider, and she read it before she found Caleb, because Caleb had asked her to handle all correspondence related to the accounts until further notice, and she took that authorization seriously enough to act on it without ceremony. Weston's message was 14 words. Matter is larger than stated. Coming Thursday. Do not approach Hargrove. Tell no one. She read it twice. Then she walked out to the north field where Caleb was working fence line with Tom Caldwell, and she handed it to him without preamble, and she watched him read it with that particular stillness he had when something landed hard. Tom Caldwell looked at neither of them and found something to check on the fence post to his left. Larger, Caleb said. That's what he says. How much larger? He doesn't say. He says Thursday. Caleb folded the paper. He put it in his coat pocket. He looked at the fence line for a moment, not seeing it. She had learned to read the difference between looking and seeing in this man, and then he looked at her. You're thinking about Hargrove's land assessments, he said. I'm thinking there are other ranchers in this county who may have been affected and don't know it, she said. I'm thinking if Weston is coming personally, instead of sending a letter, the scope of what he found in Billings is significant. The 2 ranches that sold low east of the creek. And possibly others. Hargrove has been commissioner for 12 years. If this started well before the Thornton accounts. Then there's a pattern that goes back further than 4 years, Caleb said. Yes. Tom Caldwell cleared his throat and continued not to look at either of them with the practiced discretion of a man who had worked the same land for 11 years and understood that some conversations were not for him. All right, Caleb said. He put his hand briefly on Tom's shoulder as he passed. Finish the east section. I'll send Hank out to help. He walked back toward the house. Evelyn fell into step beside him, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the ease of walking side by side, in a silence that was simply practical, that required no management, was something she noticed without remarking on it. Tell no one, he said half to himself. Weston is careful. If he says that it's because he's concerned about who might be listening. In Willow Creek. Possibly. Or beyond it. Caleb made the sound in his throat that she had come to understand meant he was processing something unpleasant in full. Hargrove has been to this ranch. He sat at my table 3 years ago for the county water rights discussion. He ate supper in my kitchen. Evelyn remembered that supper. She had cooked it. She had sat at the far end of the table and poured coffee and listened to men talk about water rights with the careful peripheral attention she applied to most things in those years, filing away details because she had nothing else to do with her sharpness except quietly observe. She remembered Hargrove as a man who spoke with great confidence and occasionally touched his mustache when he was pleased with himself. I remember, she said. He looked me in the eye when he shook my hand. Men who are very good at taking things from other people usually can, she said. He looked at her sideways as they walked. "Where did you learn that?" "From watching," she said simply. "You learn a great deal when people don't think you're paying attention." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't think you were paying attention," he said. "I know," she said. The honesty of it sat between them without cruelty. They had arrived these past days at a way of speaking to each other that was blunt, without being unkind, the particular register of people who have been carefully polite for too long and have discovered that directness is actually easier for both of them. She liked it more than she expected to. She was also more afraid of it than she expected to be, because liking things was dangerous when you had not yet decided whether they were permanent. They ate supper together that evening, which had become quietly and without any formal announcement. Simply what they did now. It had been 11 days since the morning she found him in the kitchen, and they had shared a table with purpose rather than accident. 11 days, and they had eaten together 10 of those evenings, which felt like a statistic she should not be tracking, but was. Ruth Caldwell had noticed. She had come to the kitchen door that afternoon with the pretext of returning a borrowed pot and the actual intention of determining with her particular blend of warmth and relentlessness whether what she was seeing in the yard was real. "He stopped to ask how you were this morning," Ruth said, setting the pot on the table with careful casualness. "Tom mentioned he was out early checking the south fence, and Caleb came out, and the first thing he said was, 'How is she this morning?' meaning you, before he said anything about the fence or the cattle or any of the actual ranch business." Evelyn kept slicing the bread. He was probably being polite. "Caleb Thornton has many qualities," Ruth said. "Small talk is not among them. He does not ask after people's welfare as a social exercise. If he asked how you were, it's because he wanted to know." Evelyn set down the bread knife. She turned and looked at Ruth with the expression she kept for moments when she needed to be very honest with someone she trusted. "I don't know what this is yet," she said. "It looks like—" "I know what it looks like," Evelyn said. "I know what it feels like too. That's the part that frightens me." She crossed her arms, not closed off, just self-contained, holding the thing she was about to say carefully before she let it out. "I spent 6 years waiting for him to notice me. I made a decision finally to stop waiting. I started making plans that did not include this ranch or this marriage because I had to, because hope was making me smaller." She looked at Ruth directly. "And now he is noticing, and it would be very easy to let that matter too much too fast, and I cannot afford to do that." Ruth was quiet. "What would it take," Ruth said finally, "for you to believe it was real?" Evelyn thought about that with the honesty the question deserved. "Time," she said. "Not days, not even weeks. Time. Consistency. The same man next month and the month after, not just when there's a crisis pulling us together." She paused. "And honesty. Not the honesty of shared problems. The honesty of shared interior things, the things he doesn't say, the reasons behind the walls." She met Ruth's eyes. "If he can give me that without me having to drag it out of him, then I'll believe it." Ruth nodded slowly. "That's reasonable," she said. "I know it is," Evelyn said. "I also know it's going to be very hard for him. Will you give him the chance to try?" She picked up the bread knife again. "I'm still here," she said. "That's the chance." It was enough for Ruth. She left shortly after, and Evelyn finished supper preparation in the quiet kitchen, with the particular sensation of someone who has said a true thing clearly and is now sitting with the weight of it. That evening at supper, Caleb waited until the plates were mostly cleared, and then he said with the air of a man who has been arranging an approach to something for several hours, "I need to tell you something about my father." She looked up. He was not looking at her. He was looking at the table hands around his coffee cup, the habitual position of a man who used objects as anchors when words were the territory he was crossing. "All right," she said. She kept her voice entirely neutral because she understood instinctively that the wrong response right now would close this door before it fully opened, and that was a door she had been on the wrong side of for 7 years. "My father was a man who loved very fiercely," Caleb said. "My mother said that was what drew her to him. He was completely present when he loved someone. You felt it. I remember feeling it when I was small. I remember thinking there was nothing like it." She waited. "He loved her that way for about 6 years," Caleb said. "And then something changed. I don't know what exactly. I was too young to understand it when it was happening. But he pulled back. He went into himself. He became efficient about their marriage. Correct. He provided everything except himself. He paused. My mother spent the last 11 years of her life in a marriage that worked perfectly and felt completely empty. She never left. She was not the kind of woman who left. But I watched her get smaller and quieter every year, and I was old enough by the end to understand what I was watching. Evelyn held very still. When she died, Caleb said, my father didn't speak for 3 days. And then he told me, he sat me down, and he told me that he had spent 11 years protecting her from his darkness, by keeping her at a distance, and that he understood now that he had only made her lonely, and that the protection was always if he was being honest with himself really, about protecting himself. The kitchen was completely quiet. He said that to you, she said. He said it to me, Caleb confirmed. I was 16. I didn't fully understand it at the time. I thought I understood it. I thought I was taking it as a warning. He finally looked up at her. I didn't understand until very recently that I had taken it as a blueprint instead. She breathed. She looked at this man across the supper table, the man she had cooked for and managed accounts for and watched leave rooms without looking at her for 7 years, and she saw him in a way that was different from any way she had seen him before. Not more forgivable, not less complicated, but human in a way he had never allowed her to see. Caleb, she said, I'm not telling you this so that you'll excuse 7 years, he said quickly. This is not an explanation I want you to accept as a reason. I know that, she said. I'm telling you because you said you needed the interior things, the things behind the walls. He held her gaze with an effort that was visible and steady. That's what's behind them. My father's voice telling me that loving someone fully means eventually destroying them. And me spending 7 years believing that keeping you at arm's length was something I was doing for you. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, did you ever consider what it felt like from my side of the arm's length? No, he said. And the simplicity of it, the undeflected honesty of it, landed harder than any elaborate answer could have. I considered what I was protecting you from. I did not think about what I was doing to you. I'm ashamed of that. She folded her hands on the table. Your father was wrong, she said. Not about himself. He may have been exactly right about himself. But the lesson he gave you was wrong. Loving someone fully doesn't destroy them. Loving someone and then removing yourself to manage your fear destroys them. She held his gaze. I am not a fragile thing that needed protecting from your darkness, Caleb. I am a woman who would have chosen to stand in it with you, if you had ever let me. His jaw moved. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm beginning to understand that, he said. Good, she said. Don't stop. She got up to pour more coffee. And he watched her cross the kitchen, and when she came back and set his cup in front of him, he said very quietly, I heard you, you know, the night you were feverish. She stopped. She stood with the coffee pot in her hand. What you said in your sleep, he said. I told you I couldn't hear it. I could. The kitchen held that sentence. She looked at him. You said my name, he said. Just that. The way, not the way you say it when you're telling me supper is ready. The way a person says something they've been carrying. He looked at his hands. I have thought about that every day since. She set the coffee pot down very carefully. She sat back down across from him. She was aware that her heart was behaving badly, and that she had very limited control over that, and that maintaining her expression at something close to composed required active effort. Why didn't you knock, she said. I was afraid of what you'd think, he said. That I'd heard you in a private moment, that I was... He stopped. I was afraid that if I knocked you'd realize how long I'd been standing there. How long had you been standing there? He met her eyes. Long enough to understand, he said, that I had spent 7 years being afraid of losing you while doing everything that would make you leave. The words from Part 3's drive home, that same recognition, but spoken now directly face to face across a supper table, with the dishes still on it, and the Montana night pressing cold against the windows, and no crisis between them to hide behind. Just the two of them, and the truth of it. I'm still here, she said. I know, he said. I don't know why. Because I'm stubborn, she said. And because some foolish part of me never entirely stopped believing you were worth waiting for. Something crossed his face that she had never seen before. Not quite grief. Not quite relief. The complicated expression of a man receiving something he knows he hasn't earned and doesn't know what to do with, except be very careful not to break it. I'm going to need you to tell me, he said, when I go quiet in the wrong way. I will. I don't know how not to yet, but I'm asking you not to disappear on me when I do. I'll tell you, she said. But you have to hear me when I tell you. I will. Even when what I'm telling you is difficult. Especially then, he said. She looked at him across the table. She made a decision. Not the large decision that was not a decision for a supper table. 11 days into a changed pattern, no matter how real those 11 days felt. But a smaller decision, the decision to let the wall she'd built come down by one brick, deliberately, because he had come to her with his father's voice, and his mother's silence, and his own shame, and that deserved something in return that was equally honest. I was planning to leave, she said. He went very still. Before all of this, she said. I had been thinking seriously about what it would look like to leave the ranch, to make a different life. She kept her voice steady. I want you to know that. Not to hurt you. But because you asked for the interior things, and that was one of them. He was quiet for a moment. How close, he said. Not immediate, but real. She held his gaze. I was tired, Caleb. 7 years is a long time to be invisible in your own home. I know, he said. I need you to understand that I didn't stay because I had no choice, she said. I stayed because I chose to, and I want that choice to mean something. I want to choose it going forward, not stay, because leaving is difficult. What would make it a real choice, he said. What do you need from me? She thought about Ruth's question from that afternoon. Time, she said. Consistency. And honesty, the kind you gave me tonight about your father. Not all at once, but kept coming. I can do that, he said. I'm not asking for perfect, she said. I know what you are. I've lived with you for 7 years. I know you go quiet when you're afraid and cold when you're overwhelmed, and I know that the walls are fast and the doors are slow. I'm not asking you to be a different man. I'm asking you to be this man, the one who is sitting across this table right now. He held her gaze for a long time. I can do that, he said again, and this time it was not reassurance. It was a statement of intent from a man who did not make statements he didn't intend to keep. She nodded. She picked up her coffee cup. They sat together for another hour, talking and not talking in equal measure, and it was the most natural the house had felt in 7 years, and she did not let herself feel too much about that yet, but she noted it. She noted it carefully. Weston arrived on Thursday. He was a lean man in his 60s, spare of movement and precise of speech, the kind of lawyer who had stayed in practice as long as he had by never saying more than he intended, and always intending considerably more than he said. He came with a briefcase and a junior associate named Cole, who carried more briefcases and said almost nothing, and they were in the Thornton Ranch office by 9 in the morning with the door closed. Evelyn was present because Caleb had said simply, I'd like my wife here. No further explanation. Weston had looked at her with a brief assessing glance and inclined his head without objection. She sat to the left of Caleb and slightly back, and she kept her hands folded in her lap and her attention on Weston, and she did not look at her husband when he'd said my wife with that particular direct simplicity, as though it were an uncomplicated fact, rather than a territory they were still carefully negotiating. What I've found, Weston said, opening the first briefcase, goes considerably beyond the Thornton accounts. Commissioner Hargrove has been running a coordinated scheme that involves at minimum 4 ranches in this county and potentially 2 others in adjacent territories. The mechanism is consistent false valuations, directed sales to associated buyers' kickbacks, routed through holding accounts structured to avoid direct scrutiny. Caleb said nothing. Weston continued. The associated buyer in Billings is a development interest called Clearwater Land Holdings. He paused deliberately on the name. Evelyn said quietly, the same name as the bank. Weston looked at her. Yes, Hargrove had a hand in establishing the Clearwater Savings and Trust through a silent partnership arrangement. The bank provided both the holding account structure and the lending capacity for the development interests purchases. It is a closed loop. The room was very still. Caleb said, "How long?" "At minimum 8 years, Weston said. "Possibly longer. The paper trail I have access to covers 8 years clearly." 8 years, Caleb said. "The 2 ranches east of the creek that sold low last summer," Evelyn said. "Were those part of the pattern?" Weston looked at her with slightly more attention than before. "Yes, both of those valuations were manipulated. Both sales went to Clearwater Land Holdings below fair market by an estimated 30%. Those families," Caleb said. "The Aldersons and the Pruitts. He knew them. They were not wealthy families. 30% below market on a ranch sale was not an abstraction to people like that. They don't know." "Not yet," Weston said. "They need to know," Caleb said immediately. "When the legal process allows for it, yes," Weston said. "At this stage, premature disclosure could compromise the prosecution. Hargrove has connections within the county administration that would allow him to obscure records if he received warning." "How long until it's safe to tell them?" "If the territorial court issues the injunction I'm filing for by end of next week," Weston said, "the records will be sealed under court protection within a fortnight. At that point, notification to affected parties can proceed." Caleb nodded. His hands were flat on the desk. Evelyn could see the tension in them. Without looking directly, she had become very good at reading him in peripheral vision over 7 years of practice. "What happens to Hargrove?" she said. Weston looked at her again. She held his gaze evenly. "Criminal prosecution for fraud and abuse of public office," Weston said. "With the documentation you've provided from the Clearwater Bank combined with the territorial land records, the case is substantial. I would not like to be Commissioner Hargrove in 6 months." "Good," she said. Caleb looked at her sideways. There was something in his expression that she recognized now, a warmth that he did not know how to fully surface, but that showed at the edges. She looked back at Weston. "What do you need from us?" she asked. "Affidavits from both of you covering your discovery of the initial discrepancy, the steps taken to verify it, and the Clearwater account identification. The documentation you've assembled is excellent. It will need to be formally attested." He looked at Evelyn specifically. "Your name will be on these filings, Mrs. Thornton. It will be part of the public record when this goes to court." "That's fine," she said before Caleb could respond on her behalf. Caleb did not try to respond on her behalf. She noted that too. They spent 3 hours with Weston and the silent Cole, going through documents, answering questions, signing the preparatory forms that Weston needed for the territorial filing. Weston was thorough and occasionally sharp, and once when Evelyn caught an error in the date attribution on one of the Clearwater documents. He looked at her over the top of his papers and said, "You have a precise mind, Mrs. Thornton," with a tone that was purely professional and genuinely meant. "Thank you," she said. When Weston and Cole finally left, Caleb and Evelyn stood in the yard and watched the buggy roll toward Willow Creek in the thin afternoon light, and neither of them spoke until it was out of sight. Then Caleb said 8 years. "Yes. He sat at my table. I know. My father trusted him. Before me." He stopped. She could hear the particular effort of a man not letting something break in his voice that wanted to. "My father trusted him with a land dispute, and Hargrove represented the county fairly, or appeared to." Another pause. Either he changed, or he had not yet understood what he was capable of. "People learn what they can get away with," she said. "And then they learn to want more of it." He turned to look at her. "You said something like that before, about Perkins." "It applies to most of this," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Thank you," he said. "For today. For being in that room. I was useful. You were more than useful." He said it simply, without embellishment, the way he said things that were true. "You were the reason Weston took us seriously. A man who comes in alone with fraud allegations is a grievance. A man who comes in with his wife who found the fraud verified, it documented it, and can cite errors in legal dating on source documents." He paused. "That's a case." She felt warmth move through her chest that she did not attempt to suppress. "You would have managed," she said. "I would have managed slower and less thoroughly," he said. "And Hargrove would have had more time." She looked at the road where Weston's buggy had been. "We made a good team today," she said. It was the simplest possible way to say it. "Yes," he said. "We did." They went in for supper. She made it. He set the table, which was something he had started doing 3 days ago, without comment or ceremony. Simply arriving in the kitchen at supper time and moving to the cupboard for plates. And she had not remarked on it, because remarking on it felt like the wrong kind of attention. Like you might startle it if you named it too early. Over supper he told her for the first time about the North Pasture expansion he'd been deferring. The numbers, the land, the plan he'd had in mind for 2 years, and kept pushing back because the accounts never supported it the way he expected them to. She listened. She asked questions. He answered them and asked for her thoughts, and she gave her thoughts, and they talked about the ranch. The way two people talk about something they share, not with the transactional brevity of necessity, but with the investment of people who have a stake in the same future. She was washing up when he said from behind her, "The periodical, the New York one." She turned. He was holding a folded piece of paper. "I sent the order with Hendricks yesterday. He said the next billing supply rider is due through in 3 weeks. It should be on it." She looked at the paper. She looked at him. She thought about what she had understood on the road to Clearwater, that this was how he said things he didn't have words for in subscriptions and set tables, and "I'll be back by dark." "Thank you," she said. "You said you'd read everything twice," he said. "You shouldn't have to do that." She held his gaze. Something was moving in her chest, warm and frightening. In equal measure, the particular feeling of a woman who has been standing in front of a locked door for 7 years and has just heard the key turn in it for the first time. She was not going to throw the door open. She was going to open it slowly, carefully, the way it deserved after everything it had taken to get here. "Caleb," she said. "Yes. When this is over, the legal case, Hargrove, all of it. I want us to sit down and talk about the ranch properly. What you want to build. What I think could be improved. Not as—" She stopped. Found the right words. "Not as your wife managing your household. As partners. On equal footing." He did not hesitate. "Yes," he said. "That's what I want too." She nodded. She turned back to the dishes. She heard him behind her, not leaving just there in the kitchen, in the particular presence he had that she had spent 7 years learning to ignore, because noticing it hurt, and was only now allowing herself to feel again. "Evelyn," he said. She did not turn. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. "I know I didn't make it easy. I know I didn't make it anything close to easy. But I'm glad you're still here." Her hands went still in the dishwater. She breathed once. "So am I," she said, and meant it entirely. The injunction came through on a Tuesday. Weston sent word by the morning rider, a single line that said, "Court sealed. Proceed with notification." Evelyn read it at the desk and then walked out to find Caleb, not because he couldn't have waited 20 minutes until she'd finished her coffee, but because she had learned in these past weeks that some news belonged to 2 people simultaneously, and making one person wait for it was its own small withholding. "How was in the yard with Tom?" She held up the paper. He read it from 6 feet away in her expression before he read the words. "It's done," he said. "The records are sealed. Hargrove can't touch them now." Tom Caldwell looked at the paper, then at Caleb, then at Evelyn, with the expression of a man who had been watching something develop for a month and was quietly glad to see it arrive. "I need to ride to the Alderson place today," Caleb said. "And the Pruitts." "I know," Evelyn said. "I'd like to come." He didn't hesitate. "Be ready in an hour." She was ready in 40 minutes. The Alderson Ranch was 12 miles east, a smaller operation than the Thornton spread, run by a man named Gerald Alderson, who had sold his property 6 months ago at the figure Hargrove's assessment had set and moved his family to a rented house in Willow Creek while he looked for work. He had not found much. Evelyn had seen his wife Margaret at the dry goods store 2 weeks ago, and had thought, without knowing the full reason yet, that the woman looked like someone who had been wrung out and left to dry in a hard wind. She understood now that it was exactly that. Gerald Alderson opened his door and looked at Caleb Thornton on his rented porch, with the particular expression of a man who has been worn down enough to be suspicious of unexpected visits from people who still have their land. "Thornton," he said. "Gerald," Caleb said. "I have something important to tell you. It's going to be hard to hear, and I'm sorry it took this long to be able to say it." Gerald looked at Evelyn. She said, "May we come in?" They sat in Gerald Alderson's small rented front room, and Caleb told him plainly, and without softening it more than honesty allowed, what Hargrove had done. The false assessment. The coordinated sale. The development interest that had profited on both ends of a transaction that Gerald had believed was simply the market. Evelyn sat to Caleb's left and watched Gerald Alderson's face move through disbelief, and then a terrible settling recognition, the expression of a man who had suspected something was wrong, and had been talked out of his own suspicion by the sheer authority of a commissioner's stamp. 30%, Gerald said. Below fair market. At minimum, Caleb said. Weston believes the actual gap may be closer to 35 when full comparables are run. Gerald Alderson put both elbows on his knees and put his face in his hands. Margaret Alderson, who had come in from the kitchen and was standing in the doorway with a dish towel in her hands, made a sound that was not quite a word. Evelyn stood up and crossed to her and said quietly, "The territorial court has sealed the records. Weston believes the restitution case is strong. I won't promise you what that means in final numbers, but I want you to know it's real and it's moving." Margaret Alderson looked at her with the eyes of a woman who had been told things were going to be all right before and had learned not to trust it. "Why are you here?" she said, not unkindly, just honestly. "This isn't your fight. It became mine when I found the accounts," Evelyn said. "And these things stop being one person's fight when they're big enough." Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, "Thank you for coming." The Pruitt conversation was harder. Joseph Pruitt was a man of 62 who had ranched that east land for 30 years, and the sale of it had taken something out of him that property and money could not fully name. He sat across from Caleb with the stillness of a man who had already grieved and was not certain he had the energy to begin again. "What happens now?" he said. "Weston files the restitution claim with the territorial court," Caleb said. "The court has jurisdiction over both the land fraud and Hargrove's abuse of the commissioner's office. It takes time. I won't pretend otherwise. And Hargrove is going to be arrested by territorial marshals within the week," Caleb said. "He doesn't know the records are sealed yet." Weston timed the notification carefully. Joseph Pruitt looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb. "You found this because of the Thornton accounts." "My wife found it," Caleb said. "She found it because she was watching when no one else was." Joseph looked at Evelyn. She met his gaze and said nothing, because there was nothing to add to what Caleb had said, and she noticed in the way she noticed everything now, with the particular attention of a woman who was no longer spending all her energy surviving her own marriage, that Caleb had said it as a simple statement of fact. "My wife found it without ceremony or performance," in the tone of a man crediting what was true. "Driving back to the Thornton ranch in the late afternoon cold," she said. "You didn't have to tell them it was me." "Yes, I did," he said. "It would have been simpler to just say, 'It's accurate,'" he said. "You found it, you verified it, you identified the Clearwater account. If you hadn't been doing those books for 3 years, this runs for another 3 years, and the Pruitts and the Aldersons are not the last people who lose their land." He kept his eyes on the road. "That is a fact. It should be stated as one." She looked at the side of his face. She thought about 19-year-old Evelyn Hartwell arriving at the Thornton ranch, believing that love would grow with time and care. She thought about 26-year-old Evelyn Thornton sitting in a wagon next to her husband, while he stated as a fact that she had done something worth stating. The distance between those two women was enormous and very small at once. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed, and they drove the rest of the way home in the comfortable silence that had become over the past month one of her favorite things about being in the same space as him. 3 days later, Hargrove was arrested. She heard about it from Ruth, who had heard it from Tom, who had ridden into Willow Creek for supplies and come back with the news that 2 territorial marshals had walked into the county commissioner's office at 9 in the morning and walked out 11 minutes later with Calvin Hargrove between them. Willow Creek had apparently been extremely interested in this development. The feed store and the dry goods and the post office had all emptied into the street to watch. Ruth delivered this information with visible satisfaction. "People are saying Thornton brought the case," Ruth said. "Weston brought the case," Evelyn said. "We gave him what he needed." "People are also saying," Ruth said with the particular tone of someone who is getting to the part they actually came to say, "that Mrs. Thornton found the fraud, that it was in the ranch accounts, that if she hadn't been watching the books, Hargrove would have kept going." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. "People talk," she said. "In this case," Ruth said, "people are talking about you specifically, by name. Margaret Alderson told someone who told someone, and now it is a known fact in Willow Creek that Evelyn Thornton is the reason Hargrove is in custody." Ruth looked at her with warm directness. "I thought you should know that your name means something in this county now, something real." Evelyn set down her coffee cup. She thought about the woman who had spent years making herself smaller in rooms where no one thought to notice her. The woman who had learned to be useful in ways that were invisible, because being invisible felt safer than being seen and dismissed. She said. Ruth laughed. It was a short, genuine laugh, the kind that came from knowing someone well enough to understand what a syllable like that contained. "You are the most controlled person I have ever known," Ruth said, "and I mean that as the highest possible compliment." Caleb heard about the Willow Creek talk when he rode in later that week for the feed order. He came back quieter than he'd left, which she had learned to read. Not as the old closed-off quiet, but as the quiet of a man who was thinking through something and intended to say it. He said it at supper. "Hendricks told me 3 people stopped him today to say that the Thornton Ranch had done right by the county," he said. "He said they specifically mentioned you." "I heard something similar from Ruth," she said. "How do you feel about that?" She considered it honestly. Strange. Good. Mostly strange. Strange how? Strange because for 7 years I was the quiet woman at the end of the table, she said. And now I'm the woman who caught a commissioner defrauding 3 counties, he said. Allegedly, she said dryly. He almost smiled. She had been cataloging his almost smiles for weeks now, the way the corner of his mouth moved slightly, the way something in his eyes shifted. He was a man who felt things deeply and expressed them quietly, and she had spent so long not being allowed close enough to see the quiet expression of it that she was finding it remarkable now, like discovering a room in a house you thought you knew. Not allegedly much longer, he said. Weston says the territorial prosecutor has the Clearwater Bank records in hand. It won't be a long trial. She nodded. Joseph Pruitt came to see me this morning, Caleb said. She looked up. He wanted to thank me, Caleb said. I told him to thank you. A pause. He said he'd like to come and do that in person if you'd receive him. Something moved in her throat that she controlled very carefully. Of course, she said. Joseph Pruitt came on the Saturday with his wife Nora, who had baked something and brought it wrapped in cloth, with the shy, grateful formality of people who do not have much left, but want to give something anyway. They sat in the Thornton kitchen and drank coffee, and Nora Pruitt held Evelyn's hand at one point and said, We're going to get our land back. Weston says we're going to get it back, with the wonder of someone saying something they have not yet fully believed enough to say aloud. You'll get it back, Evelyn said. Because of you, Nora said. Because of the law, Evelyn said. I just gave the law something to work with. But she held Nora Pruitt's hand for a long moment, and across the table, Caleb was talking to Joseph about the land and the recovery timeline, and the kitchen was full. In a way, it had not been for a very long time, warm with people and coffee, and the particular kind of conversation that happened when something wrong was being made right. After the Pruitts left, Caleb stood in the kitchen doorway and said, I want to show you something. She followed him to the office. He had the North Pasture plans on the desk. The expansion he'd described to her over supper weeks ago. The one he'd been deferring for 2 years. He'd been working on it. She could see updating the figures with the corrected account totals that reflected the actual available capital once the fraudulent withdrawals were backed out. The numbers were different. The numbers were considerably better than he'd believed them to be. With the accounts restored, he said, the expansion is viable, more than viable. He pointed to the calculations. We can break ground in spring. She looked at the plans. Then she looked at him. You updated these, she said. Last week, he said. I wanted to have the actual numbers before I showed you. He looked at the desk. I want your thoughts on the east boundary decision. There are two possible approaches, and I think you'll see something I might be weighing incorrectly. She sat down. They spent an hour on the plans, the same as they'd spent hours on the accounts, talking through a shared problem from the same side. And by the end, she had in fact identified a boundary decision that would reduce the fencing cost by nearly $200 without compromising the grazing rotation, and he had listened to her reasoning and said, "You're right, that's the better approach," without any of the ego that a different man might have brought to being corrected by his wife. She was beginning to understand that this was one of Caleb Thornton's actual qualities, that beneath the walls and the silence and the years of careful removal, he was a man of genuine fairness. He called things what they were. He acknowledged what was accurate. He did not need to be right more than he needed to be correct. That was not nothing. That was in fact a great deal. It was the week after the plans conversation that things shifted again, in the small, quiet way that the significant things always seemed to shift between them. Not dramatically, not announced, but real. She was in the kitchen later than usual, sitting with a letter she had been writing to her mother in Helena. She wrote to her mother monthly careful letters that had for years been careful in their omissions as much as their content. She had not wanted to worry. Her mother had not wanted to admit to a woman who had been proud of her daughter's match how much of that match had been absence. She had been honest in the letters about the ranch, about her work, about Willow Creek. She had not been honest about the loneliness. She was writing an honest letter now, not confessional, not dramatic, just honest, describing the past month, the accounts and the fraud and the Clearwater case, and then the other thing. The thing that was harder to put in sentences, the way the kitchen had started to feel different, and the table had started to feel occupied, and the man across the hall had started slowly and imperfectly, and with visible effort to come through doors instead of building more of them. She was partway through when she heard his footstep in the hall. Not toward the kitchen. She heard him stop. She heard him in the hall the way she'd heard him weeks ago outside her door, that quality of stopped presence, a man at the edge of something deciding. Then the kitchen door opened. He came in still dressed, though it was past 10. He had clearly been working. There was dust on his sleeve from the hay he'd been storing for winter, and he looked at her at the desk with the letter in front of her, and he said, "You're still up." "So are you," she said. He crossed to the stove and poured what was left of the coffee without asking if she wanted any, poured a second cup, and set it beside her letter without being asked, and sat down at the table, not across from her, but at the corner, the adjacent position closer than they usually sat. She looked at the coffee cup. She looked at him. He was looking at the letter. "Is that to your mother?" he said. "Yes." "You write to her every month," he said. "You noticed that." "I notice more than I let on," he said. "I always have." He looked at his own cup. That was probably part of the problem. She set down her pen. "What do you mean?" "I mean I noticed everything," he said. "The lavender you hung in the kitchen. The way you reorganized the supply chest in alphabetical order because it was easier to find things. The books on every surface." He paused. "The way you stopped looking up when I came in somewhere around year 3. She was very still. "You noticed that," she said. "Yes." "And you didn't?" "I didn't say anything," he said, "because I told myself it was better. That if you'd stopped looking for something from me, you'd stopped expecting it, and if you stopped expecting it, I couldn't disappoint you anymore." He looked at her steadily. "I convinced myself that your adjustment to my absence was a form of peace. I told myself it was the kindest arrangement." She looked at him for a long moment. "It was the loneliest I have ever been," she said. "Year 3. "I know that now," he said. "I knew it then somewhere I wasn't willing to look." His jaw tightened and released. "I am ashamed of that. I want to say that directly." "I hear you," she said. "I am not asking you to tell me it's all right," he said. Good, she said. Because some of it isn't. Some of it was hard in ways that don't completely unhappen just because the present is better. I know. But, she said, and something in her chest opened very carefully, like a window that has been painted shut for a long time and requires patience and steady pressure to move. The present being better is real. I want you to know that I see it. I'm not withholding that from you. He held her gaze. Thank you, he said. They sat together in the kitchen at 10 at night with their coffee cups and her half-written letter and the late Montana dark pressed against the windows, and she thought about all the nights she had sat in this same kitchen alone, listening to the house be silent, in the particular way houses are silent when the people in them have nothing to say to each other. The house was not silent now. It was simply quiet, which was a different thing entirely. Caleb, she said. Yes, I want to tell you something I've never said out loud. He turned fully toward her and waited with the attention she had come to rely on, the real attention, not the polite management of a man going through motions, but the presence of someone who was choosing to be in the room. When I first came here, she said, I believed very completely that love was going to grow between us. I believed it the way a young woman believes things when she hasn't yet been taught better by experience. She looked at her hands. I did not stop believing it for a long time. I should probably be embarrassed by how long. Every time you did something, anything that felt like a moment of real attention, I would take it out and hold it for days. I kept a kind of private collection of them. I was very still. Year 4, she said. You fixed the window latch in my room without being asked. I had mentioned it once in passing, and 2 days later it was fixed, and you didn't say anything about it. I thought about that window latch for a month. She looked up at him. That's what I was living on, Caleb. Window latches and coffee left on the table, and the occasional moment when you answered a question with more than 4 words. That was what I had. His face was doing the complicated thing, the thing that meant he was feeling something he had not made room for and was finding it would not stay neatly aside. I'm telling you this, she said, not to make you feel worse than you already do. I'm telling you because I want you to understand what it means that I stayed. I didn't stay because I had nowhere to go, or because I was too afraid to leave. I stayed because I kept believing against increasingly poor evidence that the man who fixed the window latch without being asked was someone worth waiting for. He said very quietly, Was he? She looked at him for a long moment. He's sitting in my kitchen at 10 o'clock at night telling me that he's ashamed of year 3, she said. So I'm starting to think yes. He reached across the corner of the table. He put his hand over hers. Not a dramatic gesture, not a sweep of romance, just his hand over hers on the table, warm and deliberate and steady, the gesture of a man who has finally decided that the thing he is most afraid of losing is also the thing he has been most afraid to hold. She turned her hand over. She held his back. They stayed that way for a long time without speaking, and the kitchen was warm, and the night was cold outside. And inside the Thornton house, something that had been broken for 7 years was not fixed. It was not the kind of thing that fixed quickly, and she knew that, and he knew that, but it was mending. Slowly, honestly, one evening at a time. She finished the letter to her mother that night. She told her the truth. The territorial court handed down the verdict on Hargrove 11 weeks later on a gray February morning. Weston sent word by the early rider guilty on all counts. Sentencing in a fortnight. Restitution proceedings to begin immediately following. Evelyn read the wire at the desk. She sat with it for a moment. Then she went to find her husband. Howe was in the barn, same as the day she had brought him the first ledger, and stood beside him and waited for him to hear her. She walked in, and he looked up, and she held out the wire, and he read it, and then he stood with it in his hand for a moment, looking at something only he could see, and she waited, because she had learned the specific patience of this man's silences, the ones that were processing rather than avoiding. Pruitt gets his land back, he said. Yes. Alderson too. Yes. He looked at her. You started this, he said. I opened a ledger, she said. Evelyn. His voice had the weight in it that it had learned to carry. You started this. She held his gaze. We finished it, she said. He looked at her for another moment, and then he crossed the barn, and he put both arms around her. Not tentative, not partial, but fully the embrace of a man who has decided that holding something he loves is not the same as losing control of himself. That the two things he had confused for his entire adult life were not the same thing at all. She put her arms around him. She held on. They stood in the barn in February, with the wire in his hand, and the Hargrove verdict between them, and 7 years of cold distance behind them, and something warm and careful and real being built between them one day at a time. And she thought about the 19-year-old who had arrived at this ranch believing love would come with patience. She had been right. She had only been wrong about how long it would take. Spring came to the Thornton ranch, the way it always came to Montana, sudden and insistent, pushing through the cold, with the particular impatience of a season that has been waiting. The North Pasture expansion broke ground in April, the way Caleb had planned, and Evelyn stood at the edge of the work one afternoon, watching, and Caleb came to stand beside her, and said nothing for a while, just watched the work alongside her. 2 years ago I thought I'd miscalculated, he said. I kept going back through the figures thinking I was doing something wrong. I couldn't understand why the numbers never supported this. Because someone was taking them, she said. Because I wasn't watching, he said. Because I had delegated my trust to the wrong people and was not paying close enough attention to my own house. She looked at the side of his face. You've been paying attention now, she said. To everything, he said. And the way he said it, the slight emphasis the look he gave her, made it clear that the North Pasture was only part of what he meant. The Willow Creek Ladies' Society invited Evelyn to speak at their May gathering, which was not something that had ever happened before. The invitation came through Margaret Alderson, who had become something of a friend in the month since, and who had told Evelyn plainly that the women of the county wanted to hear from her directly about the fraud case and what it meant for property rights, and what women with access to household accounts might be in a position to notice. Evelyn told Caleb about the invitation at supper. He said immediately, "You should go." "You don't think it's—" "I think," he said, "that you have things worth saying and that people in this county are better off when you say them." He met her eyes. "I think you've been quiet long enough." She looked at him across the table. "I'll go," she said. She went. She spoke clearly and without performance about what she had found and how she had found it, about the importance of understanding accounts, about the particular position. A woman in a household occupied when it came to the management of financial records, about how visibility and attention were themselves forms of protection. The room listened. Women asked questions. Margaret Alderson sat in the front row and nodded throughout, walking back to the wagon afterward. Ruth Caldwell beside her. Ruth said, "You know what just happened in there?" "I gave a talk," Evelyn said. "You gave yourself a place in this county," Ruth said. "A real one, not as somebody's wife, as yourself." Evelyn thought about that. "I'm somebody's wife too," she said. "Those aren't separate things anymore." Ruth looked at her sideways. "He's different," Ruth said. "Caleb, I've known that man for 11 years and he is different." "Yes," Evelyn said. "Is it enough?" It was a Ruth question, the kind that went straight to the center without stopping at the polite surface. Evelyn had come to love her deeply for exactly this quality. She thought about the question honestly the way it deserved. She thought about the hand over hers on the kitchen table, about the periodical that came on the billing supply rider and was set on her desk without comment by a man who noticed she had read everything twice, about the North Pasture plans and the corrected accounts and the barn in February, and the word my wife said in a lawyer's office in a tone that was simply factual and therefore more valuable than any amount of sentiment. She thought about the window latch she had held in her private collection for a month in year 4 and about how she no longer needed a collection because she was no longer surviving on small stored moments. She was living in a present that produced them continuously, quietly without drama, in the daily language of a man who was learning to say things he had never known how to say. "It's more than enough," she said. "It's the actual thing." Ruth nodded once satisfied, and they walked to the wagon in the warm May afternoon. That evening, the last of the supper. Things cleared the kitchen clean and the lamplight low. Caleb sat across from her at the table they had shared every evening for months now, and he said in the way he had developed for saying the interior things, quiet and direct, with no framing to hide behind. "Do you remember what you said to me the night I came into the kitchen late, about the window latch?" She looked at him. "You said you kept a collection," he said. "The small things, that you were living on them." "Yes. I've been thinking about that since you said it." He looked at his hands on the table, then back at her. "I want you to know that I am going to spend whatever time I have left on this earth making sure you never need a collection again. That there is enough every day, that nothing has to be saved." She breathed. She looked at the man across the table, the complicated, wounded, slowly opening man she had married at 19 and almost left at 26, and had chosen deliberately every day since to stay beside while he learned to stay beside her. "You're already doing it," she said. "You've been doing it." He reached across the table. She gave him her hand. Outside, the Montana night spread its cold and clear expanse over the Thornton ranch, over the north pasture, where new fence posts were going in, over the house where the lamps burned in 2 rooms that no longer needed to be separate, over the yard where Ruth had stood and said, "He is different," over the road that led to Willow Creek, where 2 families were beginning the slow work of reclaiming what had been taken from them, and inside at a kitchen table that had once been the loneliest place on the property. 2 people sat with their hands joined across the wood and the lamplight between them. Not because a crisis had brought them together, or because a fraud had made them necessary to each other, but because they had both finally, and at real cost, chosen to stop being afraid of the same thing at the same time. They had not built a perfect marriage. They had built a real one. And after 7 years of living like strangers under the same roof, Evelyn and Caleb Thornton had discovered what their story was actually about. Not the grand declaration, not the dramatic rescue, not the sudden transformation of a closed heart. It was about the morning he stayed at the table after his coffee was finished. It was about the window latch he fixed without being asked. It was about the night she whispered his name in her sleep, and he heard it standing in the hall, and understood for the first time the full weight of what it meant to be loved by someone you had been too afraid to love back. It was about 2 people who had stood on the same side of enough hard things to finally trust that they could stand there permanently. That was the marriage they built. And it was the